All right, this is block 4 over there, section 5, the Treaty of Versailles, the section starting with the Irreconcilables. So Wilson has his treaty, and he gets his Treaty of Versailles, he gets his League of Nations put in the treaty, he gives up everything else to get the League of Nations in the treaty, and he comes back home across the Atlantic Ocean to get the Senate to pass the treaty. Now, constitutionally, as you ought to know, no treaty can be approved without 2/3 of the Senate voting to approve that treaty. So what Wilson had to do was go to the Senate and get his treaty voted on by the senators. And immediately he ran into problems. The first problems he ran into were from a group of senators that he became known He ran into his first trouble from a group of senators that came to be known as Irreconcilables. And the Irreconcilables were people who were not going to be voting for this treaty no matter what. That regardless of what happened, these people were not voting for the treaty. And they were led by progressive hero Robert La Follette. And La Follette said that Europe is irredeemably corrupt. The United States should have nothing to do with Europe. He did not want to go to war in the first place, and the last thing that La Follette wanted was the United States to be involved with any European affairs at all, ever again. So La Follette and a lot of the progressive Republicans, these are largely Midwestern, Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, places like that, senators from these states were called irreconcilables. No matter what happened, they were not going to be voting for this treaty. The second group of people, which were made up of a lot more than just, there was a handful, 12 or 14 irreconcilables. The second group came to be known as reservationists. And the reservationists said, we will vote for this treaty with amendments. We will vote for this treaty, but we have reservations about it. We don't like this and we don't like that. And the thing that they mostly did not like was collective security. They felt that the Treaty of Versailles took away Congress's power to declare war. They said, if the United States joins this League of Nations and an attack on one country is an attack on all countries, what has that done to Congress's constitutional power to declare war? They said it has destroyed it, and that Congress will no longer have the power to declare war in the League of Nations. They wanted to change the treaty to mean, to say that Congress had to give its approval for this. They had other reservations, but that was their primary one. These guys were led by Henry Cabot Lodge. He was a senator from Massachusetts, a Republican, really did not like Wilson at all, but said that he could be convinced to support the treaty with these reservations. If Wilson had been willing to compromise, he could have gotten the treaty passed. But Wilson was not willing to compromise. Wilson did not like Lodge. Lodge did not like Wilson. Wilson was a stubborn man in the first place. Wilson was definitely the type that once he felt that he was right, that was kind of the end of the story. And he refused to consider these amendments. The problem was, without the amendments, the treaty couldn't pass. Wilson didn't have enough support. But Lodge did not have enough support just with his reservationists. So there had to be compromise going on here in the Senate, and there was no compromise here going on in the Senate. When Lodge brought up so Lodge in the Senate, what they do was, because the president doesn't have anything to do with the workings of Congress, Senator Lodge rewrote the treaty with these reservations. and he said, okay, we're going to vote on this new form of the treaty that reflects my reservations and other reservations about the treaty. We're going to vote on this now. President Wilson ordered the Democrats in the Senate to vote against it, and they did. So the treaty with reservations failed to pass. Then Wilson went to the Senate and insisted that they vote on the treaty as it was. And Lodge told his reservationists not to vote on the treaty, and the treaty did not pass the Senate there either. Wilson was unwilling to change a single letter in the treaty to satisfy the concerns that the Republicans in Congress had. He thought that he was going to go to the American people. So Wilson decided, kind of told Henry Cabot Lodge, screw you, I'm going to go to the people, I'm going to get them in the elections to vote for people who will support my treaty. Public opinion will turn against you, and you will be forced to sign my treaty as it is. Wilson, by 1919, is not a particularly well man. He had some heart disease going on. He was exhausted. He had been working in Europe. He had been president for 8 years. And he puts himself through this grueling campaign. He takes a train and he travels around the country, and he stops in every whistle-stop town and gives speeches arguing in favor of the League of Nations. Of course, following him on the next train into town was Senator Lodge, giving the same speeches against the treaty. Wilson wore himself out. And on the treaty, he grew ill and took to his bed, and a week later suffered a debilitating stroke. Wilson was brought back to Washington in much secrecy. He was not well. He was non-functional for several weeks, but nobody knew. His wife kind of ran the country while Wilson was incapacitated. After several weeks had gone by, Wilson could sit up. But pretty much nobody, except for his private secretary and his wife, got access to the president for a long time. His wife decided which papers were important enough for him to read. His wife decided which she would write down what people wanted to tell the president and bring it into him. For the last for his last year in office, in reality, President Wilson was an invalid, and his wife kind of ran the country. The treaty never did pass the United States Senate. Wilson, neither the reservationists or Wilson's Democrats got enough votes to pass the treaty, and the treaty literally never passed the United States Senate. The United States would technically be at war with Germany until 1922, when a new treaty was passed. Wilson's baby comes to nothing. He gets his League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles. He gives up everything else that he wanted to get his League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles. And the American people, due to there's resistance based on basic isolationism, the progressives, and there's resistance based on the argument of congressional sovereignty that Lodge raises. But overall, Wilson dies in 1924, kind of a bitter and a broken man, that the United States did not rise to what he considered the station that it ought to rise to. And the League of Nations would live out its entire existence without the United States a part of it. So that was the fate of the treaty.